My name is Renata Voss, and I'm 41 years old. I watched them pull the moving truck into my father's driveway from the window of what used to be the guest room, the one where I slept every Christmas for 32 years on a pull-out couch that left a permanent dent in the shape of a spring along my lower spine. I didn't move. I didn't call anyone. I just stood at that window with a mug of black coffee that had already gone cold, and I watched. My sister Cecily was directing the movers like a woman who had rehearsed this moment for years. Arms wide, pointing left, pointing right, laughing at something one of the men said. She was wearing my mother's pearl earrings. I noticed that immediately. The ones my father had specifically told me were set aside for me in a conversation I had written down, verbatim, in a notebook I still own, dated March 14th, 2 years ago. My brother Dane was leaning against the hood of his truck, arms crossed, watching the process with the kind of smug satisfaction men develop when they believe they have outmaneuvered someone and that person doesn't yet know it. He hadn't outmaneuvered anyone. He'd simply moved faster than he thought I would. He confused my silence for ignorance. There were at least 11 items loaded into that truck in the first 40 minutes: a mahogany sideboard, 2 oil paintings, the antique clock from the front hallway, boxes that clinked and shifted in ways that told me glassware was inside them. My grandmother's china, if I had to guess, which I didn't, actually. Because I had already photographed and cataloged every item in that house 4 months before my father passed. I let them load. I let them feel the ease of it, the uncomplicated thrill of helping themselves. Because 3 days later, they would discover what I had quietly ended. And I needed them to believe, right up until that moment, that they had won. Before I go any further, if you are watching this right now and you know exactly what it feels like to be the one who was overlooked, the one who was treated like the backup plan, the insurance policy, the one the family only calls when something needs doing or something needs doing or something needs doing, drop your city and the time you're watching in the comments. I read every single one. And if you are new here, this channel is where I tell my story in full, not the version my family tells at dinner parties. Mine. If that is something you need right now, something real, something that sounds like your own life reflected back at you, then subscribe. The bell icon. All notifications. Because the next part of this story is where things get very specific and very quiet and very irreversible. Stay with me. I grew up in a town in central Ohio called Mill Haven, population just over 9,000, though it always felt smaller than that. Like everyone had agreed at some point to stay inside and observe each other through windows rather than actually speak. It was a town of churches and diners and the particular brand of local pride that manifests as defensiveness about anyone who leaves. We had one stoplight on the main road, a grain elevator you could see from almost anywhere in town, and a library that closed on Tuesdays for reasons no one ever satisfactorily explained to me. My father, Gerald Voss, was an insurance adjuster for most of his working life. He had the job for 31 years with the same regional firm, and he was good at it. Not brilliant, not ambitious, but meticulous in a way that I now recognize I inherited entirely. He kept files on everything. He cross-referenced documents. He didn't trust memory, not even his own. If it's not written down, he told me once when I was about 9 years old, sitting at his desk watching him organize folders, it didn't happen the way you think it did. I wrote that down. Even then, I wrote things down. My mother, Diane, was a woman of tremendous feeling and almost no follow-through. She loved loudly and inconsistently, which is perhaps the most exhausting combination a child can be raised inside of. She adored Cecily, my younger sister, born 4 years after me, with a completeness that had a shape to it, an outline you could trace. Cecily got the long conversations at the kitchen table. Cecily got the spontaneous drives to the mall, the loans that were never called loans, the phone calls that lasted 2 hours on a Tuesday night just because. I got competence. I was competent, and in our family, competence was treated as a resource to be extracted, not a quality to be celebrated. Dane came third, 5 years behind me. He was the boy, which in our household settled certain questions before they were even asked. He didn't have to earn gentleness, he simply received it. I want to be precise about what the favoritism looked like, because it was not theatrical, it was not the kind of cruelty you find in fairy tales, no stepmother locking me in towers, no explicit declarations of preference. It was quieter than that, and quieter things leave deeper marks. It was the fact that Cecily's school performances were attended by both parents and mine by one, if any. It was the birthday where my mother spent $420 on a party for Cecily's 16th and gave me $60 cash in an envelope for mine, which she forgot until the afternoon of the actual day. It was the college conversation, when Cecily was applying and my father spent a Sunday afternoon at the kitchen table going through every option with her: programs, campuses, financial aid packages laid out in color-coded folders. When I had applied 3 years earlier, my mother had said from the couch, "You're smart. You'll figure it out." I figured it out. I applied to 7 schools. I got into 4. I chose the state university 3 hours away because it had a co-op accounting program that would let me work and study simultaneously, which meant I could largely fund my own education through placement years rather than accumulate debt we didn't have the family structure to manage together. I told my father my plan. He nodded and said he was proud of me. I think he meant it. He was also, I came to understand later, simply relieved that the logistics had resolved themselves without requiring him to advocate. My first semester, I came home for Thanksgiving. Cecily was 16 and had just been given a car. A used Honda, nothing extravagant but a car, a thing with keys and independence sewn into the metal of it. I rode the Greyhound bus 3 hours each way that weekend. Nobody offered to pick me up at the station. I took a taxi. It cost me $19, which, at that point in my financial life, was not a trivial sum. I didn't say anything about it. I set my bag down and helped my mother peel potatoes and let the table talk roll over me like weather. That weekend, though, I noticed something that would take me years to fully articulate. My father watched me. Not with pride, not with concern, with a kind of curious, almost puzzled attention. The way you watch someone solve a problem you assumed was unsolvable. I was 18 and independent and organizing myself inside a world that had never been organized for me, and I think that puzzled him. I think he had expected that I would either struggle and need rescue, or struggle and be bitter. He had not factored in that I might simply proceed. I proceeded. I came home less and less as the years went on, not out of coldness, I want to be honest about this, but out of resource management. Time was a resource. Money was a resource. Emotional energy was perhaps the most finite resource I owned, and returning to a house where I was simultaneously invisible and expected to perform gratitude for that invisibility cost me more of it than I could afford. The dynamic that formed between me and my siblings in those years was one I've had to describe to therapists, to colleagues, to the one close friend who has known me long enough to have watched it in real time. I was used as a comparison. Renata would never ask for that. Renata just handles things herself. You should be more like your sister. My competence and my distance were held up as standards. My siblings were measured against in the moments it was convenient, and then they were held against me. As coldness, as arrogance, as the reason I was hard to love. In the moments when the family needed someone to blame for the distance between us. Hard to love. My mother said that to me once. Directly. I was 26, home from my father's retirement party, standing in the kitchen cutting fruit because someone needed to and no one else had started. She came in to refill her wine glass and said almost conversationally, "You know you've always been a little hard to love, Renata, not like Cecily. Cecily just opens up." I kept cutting the fruit. I did not respond. She refilled her glass and left. I finished the platter, put it on the table, smiled at my father's colleagues, and drove 4 hours home that night instead of staying over as I'd planned. I did not call her for 6 weeks after that. She didn't notice for 4 of them. I want to tell you that I was bitter. I want to tell you that I spent those years in a state of smoldering resentment, plotting and cataloging my grievances. It would make a better story in some ways. But the honest answer is that I was busy. I was building something, and the building required all of me, and I had learned very early that what the family had not given me was, in the final accounting, a kind of freedom I owed them nothing in the specific way you only owe the people who invested in you. I was a self-funded enterprise from the age of 18, and self-funded enterprises answer to no board. My father, to his credit, softened as he aged. In his late 60s, after my mother passed from a cardiac event that was sudden and genuinely devastating to all of us, whatever else she had been ours, he became quieter and more deliberate. He called me more often. He asked real questions. He visited my home once, the year I turned 35, and walked through the rooms of the house I had purchased and renovated largely by myself, and he said, "Renata, how did you do all of this?" And I said, "The same way I did everything else, Dad. I just kept going." He put his hand on my shoulder and held it there for a moment, and I think that was his version of "I'm sorry." I accepted it. Not because it was enough. Because it was what he had. That visit changed something between us. Not everything. We were who we had always been. But something. We spoke more regularly in the last 3 years of his life. He told me things about his own childhood that explained, though did not excuse, certain patterns. He trusted me with his finances when his health began to decline, because Cecily and Dane had both made what he called disappointing choices with money across the years, and my track record was simply different. I managed his accounts carefully and honestly. I filed his taxes. I coordinated his medical appointments. I drove 4 hours each way on 6 occasions in the last year of his life to take him to specialist visits in Columbus, because neither Cecily nor Dane volunteered, and I did not have it in me to watch my father navigate a waiting room alone. And in one of those Columbus visits, in the car afterward, he told me what he had decided to do with the house. Let me tell you who I became, so that what comes next makes full sense. I graduated from Ohio State with a degree in accounting and a minor in business law, the latter added in my junior year almost on impulse, because a professor named Dr. Carol Mering told me after class one day that I had the temperament for contracts, and that people with that temperament usually regretted not formalizing it. She was right. I spent 22 years in corporate accounting, the last 12 of which were in forensic accounting, the work of finding in a financial record the thing that doesn't want to be found. It is not glamorous work. It is not the kind of work that gets photographed, but it pays with a precision that rewards precision in return, and I am, as I have explained, a precise person. By the time I was 34, I owned my home outright. It was a 4-bedroom Victorian in a small city outside Columbus. Nothing palatial, but solid, well restored, with a garden I tended on Sunday mornings as a form of deliberate slowness in an otherwise very fast life. By 37, I had a portfolio of 3 additional rental properties, managed through a small LLC I had structured carefully with a real estate attorney I trusted. By 40, my professional reputation was such that I was retained by law firms and regional corporations as an independent consultant on cases requiring someone who could read a financial pattern the way other people read faces. I did not have a partner. I want to acknowledge that fact plainly, without performing either contentment or grief about it. There had been a relationship, a long one, 7 years, with a man named Marcus who was kind and intelligent, and ultimately wanted a life that looked different from the one I was building. We parted without cruelty. I was 32. After that, there were smaller involvements that I handled the way I handle most things, with clarity about what they were and careful attention to what they cost. What I had instead of a traditional family structure was a small, dense network of people I trusted completely. My neighbor and close friend Adrian, who had known me since we were both young professionals, attending the same professional women's network in Columbus, and who once drove 2 hours at midnight to sit with me in an emergency room without being asked. My accountant mentor Phyllis Hartley, now in her late 70s, who had taken me to lunch once a month for the first 4 years of my career, and who had taught me, among other things, that the most powerful move in any room is to be the person who is never surprised. My paralegal colleague Jonah, who handled the document side of my consulting work with a quiet competence I found deeply restful. These 3 people, along with the structures I had built, financial, legal, professional, constituted my actual family in every meaningful sense. They were the ones who knew my history. They were the ones who had seen me cry, which was a short list. They were the ones who would receive a call at 6 in the morning and answer on the second ring. Now, my father and the house. The house in Millhaven was nothing remarkable by external standards. 3 bedrooms, a large yard, a detached garage that had been converted to a workroom decades earlier. What it represented was the entire physical accumulation of my parents' life together. Furniture, objects, papers, memories pressed into drawers and attics. My mother had lived in that house for 44 years. My grandmother's china was stored in the sideboard, my great-aunt's oil paintings hung in the front hallway. There were things in that house that had no dollar value and absolute sentimental value, and there were things with significant dollar value that would require a clear head and clear documentation to distribute fairly. My father had told me in the car outside the Columbus Oncology Center on a Tuesday in October, 18 months before he died, that he had updated his will. He said he had done it with his lawyer, a man named Garrett Foley who had offices in Millhaven and who had handled my parents' estate planning for years. He said he had thought carefully about what was fair and what was right, and that those two things in his assessment were not always the same. He said Cecily and Dane would receive cash distributions from his retirement accounts and would divide certain personal property as listed in a schedule attached to the will. He said the house itself, along with its contents not specifically listed in the schedule, would come to me. He said he was doing this because I was the only one of his children who had not, at various points, asked him for money. He said he was doing this because I had managed his affairs for 3 years without compensation and without complaint. And he said, and this is the part I have never told anyone in my family, the part I wrote in my notebook that night in my Columbus hotel room and cried over alone for approximately 20 minutes. He said he was doing this because he was sorry he hadn't made things easier for me when it would have mattered more, and this was the only form the apology could take now. I told him he didn't have to, he said he knew, and he was doing it anyway. I drove home from Columbus that night and called Phyllis. I told her what my father had said. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Good. Now document everything in that house." I told her I would start that weekend. She said, "No, Renata. This weekend. Not a weekend. This one." I drove to Millhaven that Saturday. I spent 9 hours in that house while my father rested, photographing every room, every object I could identify. I created a spreadsheet with item descriptions, estimated values where I could, and photographic references. I did this quietly and methodically. I did not tell Cecily or Dane. I did not tell my father I was doing it, because I did not want him to feel surveilled in his own home. I told him I was just visiting, which was also true. Cecily dropped by that afternoon. She saw me with my phone and asked what I was doing. I said I was taking photos of the house because I hadn't been home in a while and wanted to remember it. She accepted this explanation with the ease of someone who has never found it necessary to read between lines. She stayed for an hour, ate crackers and cheese at the kitchen table, and left. That was the moment I should have known with full certainty what was coming. Because as she was leaving, she paused at the front hallway and looked at the oil paintings for a long moment, the ones my grandmother had brought from Germany, the ones with the particular gold leaf frames that any antique dealer would recognize as genuinely valuable, and she said, almost to herself, "Those are really beautiful, aren't they?" It wasn't a question. My father died on a Wednesday in April at 6:43 in the morning. He had been moved to palliative care 11 days earlier, and I had driven to Millhaven and stayed for 8 of those 11 days. I slept in the guest room on the pullout couch. I coordinated with the hospice nurses. I made sure he had his specific brand of orange juice, the one without pulp, in the small bottles which he'd been drinking since before I was born, because details like that are what you can control when everything else is beyond it. Cecily visited twice. Dane visited once. Neither stayed overnight. I was with him when he died. I held his hand. I am telling you this, not for sympathy, but for the record. I was there. The funeral arrangements were made. The obituary was written. I drafted it and sent it to Cecily and Dane for review, and Cecily replied with 2 small edits, and Dane didn't reply at all. The service was attended by roughly 60 people, former colleagues, neighbors, a handful of relatives from both sides who I hadn't seen in years. I stood at the door and greeted people for 2 hours and thanked them for coming, and managed the logistics with the funeral home and the church reception afterward. I did all of this because no one else was going to do it to the standard it deserved, and my father deserved the standard. The will reading was scheduled 12 days after the funeral, at Garrett Foley's office. I want to describe those 12 days because they are where the betrayal took shape. On day 2, Cecily called me and said she was going to go to the house to start sorting through things and wanted to know if I would come. I said I would prefer to wait until after the will reading, when we would have formal clarity on the distribution. There was a pause on the line. She said, "Renata, it's just organizing. We're not taking anything." I said, "Let's wait for the reading, Cess. It's 12 days." Another pause. Then she said, "Fine, of course," and hung up with warmth in her voice that felt careful. On day 4, my neighbor in Millhaven, an older woman named Patrice who had lived across the street from my parents for 20 years and who had my cell number because I'd given it to her as an emergency contact for my father, called to ask if I knew that Cecily and Dane had been over. She mentioned it conversationally as a piece of neighborhood news. She did not know she was delivering a grenade. I thanked Patrice warmly and ended the call. I sat with that information for approximately 4 minutes. Then I called Garrett Foley's assistant and asked whether, in advance of the reading, she could confirm that the personal property schedule attached to the will was secure and that no property had been formally transferred. The assistant confirmed that the schedule was on file and that no transfers had been processed. She couldn't speak to the physical condition of the house. I drove to Millhaven the next morning. I let myself in with the key my father had given me, the one I'd had for 4 years. I walked through the house room by room. The mahogany sideboard in the dining room was gone. The space where it had stood had a slightly different color on the hardwood floor, a rectangle of slightly less faded wood, where the piece had protected the surface for 30 years. Both oil paintings from the front hallway were gone. My grandmother's china, the full set, service for 12, stored in the sideboard that was now missing, was gone with it. The antique clock from the entryway was gone. From my father's bedroom, the sterling silver brush and mirror vanity set that had been my mother's and which was specifically noted in the personal property schedule as going to me, gone. I walked through every room. I counted 14 missing items. I had photographed 11 of them on that Saturday 9 months earlier. I pulled out my phone and compared my photos to the empty spaces. I took new photographs of every empty space. I wrote down the time 9:47 a.m. and the date on a fresh page in the small notebook I keep in my bag. Then I sat down on the couch in the living room, and I did not move for 11 minutes. I know it was 11 minutes because I watched the clock. I was not crying. I want to be precise about this. What I felt in those 11 minutes was not grief, exactly. Not in the way I'd felt grief 12 days earlier, holding my father's hand in a hospital room. What I felt was something more architectural, a weight redistribution. The sensation of understanding clicking into place like the last number of a combination lock. I had known this was a possibility. I had prepared for this possibility. What I was experiencing was not the shock of betrayal, but the grim confirmation of a long-held working hypothesis. They had taken things, specific things they had assessed and decided had value and removed before the legal process could formalize who those things belonged to. I called Garrett Foley directly. He picked up. I told him what I had found. I read him the list of missing items from my notebook. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Renata, I need you to send me those photographs. The ones from before, and the ones from today." I sent them within the hour. He called back and said he needed to speak with Cecily and Dane before the reading, but that the will was unambiguous, and the removal of property prior to probate finalization was a legal problem he would be addressing with them directly. I said, "Garrett, don't address it with them before the reading. Let them come to the reading not knowing what I know." There was a pause. He said, "Renata, that's..." I said. Complicated, yes, but more honest than having a conversation that gives them time to construct a story. I'd rather the story be constructed in the room. Another pause. Then he said, All right. I'll need you to sign off on that approach as the primary beneficiary. I said, Send me the form. In the 8 days between that conversation and the will reading, I did the following. I had Garrett's assistant provide me with the contact information for 2 certified appraisers my father had worked with through his insurance career. I called both of them. I requested that the remaining contents of the house be appraised formally with a written report, which I commissioned and paid for at my own expense before the reading. I pulled the photographs I had taken 9 months earlier and organized them into a PDF document, item by item, with descriptions and estimated replacement values sourced from auction databases and antique dealer records I accessed online. This took 11 hours, spread across 3 evenings. I cross-referenced every item against my father's insurance writer, which he had updated 18 months earlier and which I had a copy of because I had helped him update it. I contacted a property attorney in Columbus, a woman named Sylvia Marsh who had been referred to me by a colleague and who specialized in estate disputes, and retained her services, not because I was certain I would need litigation, but because I am my father's daughter and I do not trust memory, and I do not walk into important rooms without having already mapped the exits. And on the evening before the will reading, I made one more call. I called Cecily. I kept it short and warm, and I told her I was looking forward to seeing her tomorrow, that it would be good to have a chance to sit together as a family and have some clarity. She said yes, of course, and that she loved me. I said I loved her too. I do love her. That is not a contradiction. You can love someone and simultaneously document every way they have wronged you with the thoroughness of a forensic audit. I have made my peace with the fact that both of those things can be true. I drove to Millhaven that night and stayed at the Holiday Inn 12 minutes from the house. I had a glass of wine. I ordered room service, a Caesar salad and a bowl of soup. And I ate slowly and I read a novel for an hour and I went to sleep before 10. People always seem surprised by this when I tell them I slept the night before. As if difficulty sleeping would have served some purpose. I needed to be rested. I had a long day ahead. Let me take you back. Back before that hotel room, back before the missing sideboard, back before the will and the oncology waiting rooms and the long quiet years of my father's softening. Back to when I was 22 and newly graduated and arriving in Columbus with a used car, one suitcase, $4,000 in a savings account, and the specific kind of confidence that isn't arrogance but is simply the absence of anyone to rescue you. I need to tell you this section slowly, not for drama. Because this is the part that matters most, and most people skip it in favor of the confrontation. But I promise you, the confrontation is only possible because of what I built. The power in that reading room existed because of 10,000 individual decisions I made in the years before it. Every single one of them. My first job out of school was with a regional audit firm called Hartley Brennan. Yes, the same Hartley as Phyllis. Though I didn't know that at hiring. I was brought on as a junior associate at a salary of $38,000 a year, which in Columbus at 22, living carefully, was sufficient if not comfortable. I rented a studio apartment with a window that faced a parking garage, and I furnished it with things I found on Craigslist. And I ate a lot of pasta, and I was the first person in the office, and often the last to leave. The work was not glamorous. Audit work at that level is almost entirely detail review, verifying ledger entries, reconciling accounts, checking documentation against reported figures. Most of my colleagues found it tedious. I found it stabilizing. There was a clear standard. Either the numbers matched or they didn't. Either the documentation supported the entry or it didn't. Nobody's feelings about it changed the answer. After a childhood spent navigating a household where the truth of things shifted depending on who was telling them and who was listening, the objective clarity of a balance sheet was genuinely comforting to me. Phyllis Hartley was a senior partner who had, by that point, been in the industry for 30 years. She was in her early 50s when I met her, silver-haired and precise, with reading glasses she wore on a chain and a habit of clicking her pen 3 times before she made any significant statement. She was not warm in the conventional sense. She was something better. She was honest. She told you exactly what she thought in exact language, and she expected the same in return, and she had no patience for hedging or performance. She noticed me in my third month. I had caught a discrepancy in a quarterly report that two senior associates had signed off on, a classification error that wasn't intentional fraud, but would have created a significant problem in the client's tax filing if not corrected. I had flagged it in a memo, addressed to the account manager, with supporting documentation. Phyllis saw the memo. She called me into her office, which nobody had done yet, and she asked me 3 questions: how I had found it, what I thought should be done about it, and whether I had told anyone other than the account manager. I answered all 3 correctly. She nodded. She said, "Come to lunch with me on Thursday." That was it. No preamble, no compliment, just Thursday. We had lunch every month for 4 years. I want to tell you what Phyllis gave me, because it wasn't mentorship in the conventional sense. Not advice dispensing, not hand-holding. What she gave me was witness. She watched me work and she named precisely what she saw. Not flattery. Precision. You are particularly good at identifying what should be there that isn't. Most people only find what shouldn't be there that is. The missing thing is harder. She told me that my temperament, the composure, the documentation habit, the resistance to emotional coloring of facts was a professional asset in a world that routinely mistook emotion for insight. She told me to stop apologizing before I spoke in meetings, not because my opinions were always right, but because the apology was costing me credibility with people who did not deserve the concession. In my third year at Hartley Brennan, I handled my first case that touched forensic work. A client suspected of internal fraud that had been going on for years without detection. I stayed late for 42 nights straight, working through transaction histories, building a timeline, identifying the pattern. When I presented my findings, the room was silent for 8 seconds. I counted them. The managing partner said I had done in 6 weeks what he had expected to take 6 months. Phyllis, from across the table, clicked her pen 3 times and smiled. After that, the trajectory bent upward sharply. By 28, I was a senior associate. By 31, I was leading my own engagements. I began taking referral work from law firms, depositions, expert witness preparation, cases where a financial pattern needed to be translated into language a jury or a judge could follow. I was good at translation. I had spent my childhood decoding environments that didn't speak plainly. I knew how to find the story inside the numbers and tell it without distortion. The rental properties began at 32, when a colleague mentioned in passing that she was selling her duplex, and I asked, instead of making small talk, what she was asking for it. I bought it within 6 weeks. I renovated the second unit myself over a series of weekends, with a level of dogged amateurishness that yielded, eventually, professional results. The first month it rented for $850, which went directly into a separate account I labeled, in my own system, Future. Within 3 years, that duplex had paid its own carrying costs and generated a net positive. I used the equity to purchase the second property. I am telling you the specific numbers, the 38,000, the 42 nights, the $850, because I want you to understand that none of this arrived in a lump. It was assembled. It was the accumulation of individual decisions made at individual moments when the easier choice was available and I chose the harder one. Not because I am exceptional, because I was not waiting for someone to choose it for me. The Victorian house I bought at 34 is the one I still live in. I found it in a state of graceful disrepair, good bones, neglected skin, and I saw in it what I have always been able to see, the thing that should be there, underneath the thing that currently is. I spent 8 months restoring it with a combination of contractors for the structural work and my own hands for everything else. The kitchen took me 4 weekends. The garden took 2 full seasons. I planted a serviceberry tree in the back corner because Phyllis had told me, at lunch in my second year, that you should plant a tree somewhere you intend to stay. I intended to stay. On a Sunday morning in October, when I had been in that house for 3 years and it was fully, finally itself. The floors stripped and restained. the crown molding replaced, the garden in its second seasonal bloom. I sat on the back porch with coffee and I thought, I built this. Not we, not with help. I built this from $38,000 a year and a window facing a parking garage, through 42 consecutive late nights and a mentor who clicked her pen 3 times and $4,000 in a savings account and a bus ticket home at Thanksgiving that cost me $19 and a determination that lived in me like a structural element, load-bearing, invisible from the outside but present in every wall. Nobody handed me this. That sentence matters to me. Not because I need credit, I have enough. It matters because there is a specific kind of confidence that only comes from the knowledge that you can explain, step by step, exactly how you arrived where you are. Not luck, not connection, not inheritance, construction. Which is, of course, the cruel irony of what my father left me. He left me the house, a thing. And I already had the architecture. What he gave me was not rescue. He gave me recognition, decades late, that the thing I had built without him was worth acknowledging. I accepted it the way I accepted his hand on my shoulder that afternoon, not as enough, but as what was available, and therefore worth receiving. The 3 women who had most shaped my professional life, Phyllis, Dr. Mering, and Sylvia Marsh, the estate attorney, were all, I realized only recently, versions of the same figure. Women who had built their competence in rooms that did not originally have space for them, who had learned to be more precise than the people who underestimated them, and who passed that precision along like a currency that compounds. I have tried, in the years since, to be that woman for others, to name precisely what I see in the young women who work with me, to say, this is what you are doing, this is what it's worth, stop apologizing before you speak. That is the inheritance I actually care about, the one that doesn't fit in a moving truck. Okay. I need to pause here for just 1 second because I want to know where you are in this story. We are about to go into the will reading, and I want to know, before it happens, what you think I did with the information I had. Did I? Option A. Present everything in the room, calmly, and let the documents speak. Option B. Confront Cecily privately before the reading and give her a chance to return the items. Option C. Say nothing in the reading and let the legal process run its course afterward. Drop your answer in the comments. A, B, or C. I read every single one, and the actual answer is going to surprise most of you who think you know how this ends. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now would be the time. The next part does not hold back. Garrett Foley's office was on the second floor of a building on Millhaven's Main Street, above a pharmacy that had been there since my childhood, and beside a tax preparation office that appeared to only exist in January and February. The building smelled of old carpet and climate control and the particular institutional stillness of a place that conducts important conversations as a matter of routine. I arrived 11 minutes early. I parked 2 blocks away and walked because I needed the movement. Garrett was already in when I arrived. His assistant offered me water and I accepted it. I sat in the waiting room for 8 minutes with my bag on my lap and my notebook in my hand, and I went over, one more time, the sequence I had planned. Not what I would say. I had no speech prepared. I do not prepare speeches. I find that improvised precision is more convincing than rehearsed precision, because you cannot fake the specific quality of someone who simply knows things. What I reviewed was the order, what I had, when to surface it, what the response would likely be, and what came after that. Cecily arrived 4 minutes before the appointed time. She was dressed well, a blazer, good earrings, put together in a way that read as important occasion energy. She saw me and smiled and crossed the waiting room and hugged me. I hugged her back. She smelled of the same perfume she'd worn since college. I noticed she was not wearing the pearl earrings today. They had been replaced with small gold hoops. Dane arrived exactly on time. He nodded at me, the kind of nod men give when they are trying to project that they are not thinking about anything in particular, which generally indicates the opposite. He was wearing a collared shirt and jeans. He looks like someone who had made an effort he was not comfortable with. We sat. Garrett came in. He shook hands with all 3 of us. His assistant closed the door. The room was small and organized. A conference table that seated three chairs occupied, one stack of folders in front of Garrett, a legal pad, two pens. The window behind him looked out onto the main street. I could see the pharmacy sign and, at the far end of the block, the grain elevator that had been visible from everywhere in Millhaven for as long as I had been alive. Garrett began with the standard framework, the date of the will, the fact that it had been updated 18 months before my father's death, the legal attestation of its validity. His voice was measured and professional in the way of a person who has done this many times and has learned to be neither cold nor warm because either extreme makes the room harder to manage. He explained the structure, retirement accounts, personal property schedule, real property. I watched Cecily and Dane as he spoke. Cecily had her hands folded on the table in front of her. Dane had one arm over the back of his chair, a posture of relaxed expectation. Neither of them looked at me. Both of them were watching Garrett with the particular attention of people listening for their name and the number that follows it. Garrett distributed copies of the will to each of us. I already had a copy. Garrett had sent one to Sylvia, who had sent it to me, but I accepted the fresh copy and opened it without expression. The retirement account distributions were read first. Cecily received 40%. Dane received 40%. I received 20%, which was the arrangement my father had explained to me. He said I needed it less, and I had agreed, because I did. And because disagreeing would have felt small. Cecily made a small, satisfied sound. Dane uncrossed his arm from the chair back. Then Garrett reached the real property section. The property at 414 Sycamore Lane, Millhaven, Ohio, Garrett read, including the structure and all contents thereof not otherwise specified in the attached personal property schedule, is bequeathed in its entirety to Renata Elaine Voss. Shh. The room changed. I watched it change the way you watch weather change, the slight drop in atmospheric pressure before the thing arrives. Cecily's hands unfolded. Dane's chin came forward. Both of them looked at me for the first time since sitting down. Cecily said, "The whole house?" Garrett said, "That's correct." Dane said, "All of it." And there was something in the way he said it, not disbelief exactly, but recalculation, the rapid internal math of someone whose assumption has just been corrected. Garrett said, "The personal property schedule specifies certain items to be divided between Cecily and Dane. Everything else, the real property itself and its remaining contents, goes to Renata." I was looking at the copy of the will in my hands. I did not look up. I let the silence do its work. Cecily said, "Dad never said anything to me about he wasn't required to," I said. Quietly, not unkindly. She looked at me. She was not angry yet. She was still in the recalculation phase. "Renata, did you know about this?" "He told me about his wishes, yes." "Dane, when?" 18 months ago?" Another silence. Dane's jaw tightened, not dramatically, just the small physical betrayal of a thought he was trying not to show. Cecily turned to look at the will in her own hands, scanning it the way you scan a document when you know you can't change what it says, but you're looking anyway for the clause that gives you an exit. It was at this exact moment that I reached into my bag and removed the manila envelope I had prepared. I set the envelope on the table in front of me and placed my hands flat on either side of it. Garrett looked at it. He knew what was inside it. We had discussed it. Cecily looked at it. Dane looked at it. I said, "Before we finalize anything today, I need to raise a separate matter. One that I believe Garrett will need to note for the record." I looked at Garrett. He nodded. I opened the envelope. Inside were 3 documents, the PDF I had compiled from my 9-month-old photographs with item descriptions and estimated values, a printed copy of my father's insurance rider showing the covered items and their replacement values, and the appraisal report I had commissioned in the week before the reading. I slid a copy of each to Cecily and to Dane. I kept my own copies in front of me. "Between my father's death and this morning," I said, 14 items were removed from the property at 414 Sycamore Lane. The items are photographed and described in the first document. Those photographs were taken 9 months ago during a visit I made to help my father. I paused. The second document is his insurance writer, showing those items as covered personal property at that address as recently as 14 months ago. The third is an appraisal report for the remaining contents of the house, commissioned to establish a baseline for the estate. I let that land. Cecily said, Renata, and her voice had a new quality in it. Not the recalculation anymore. Something closer to actual fear. I kept going. The total estimated value of the removed items based on the insurance rider and appraisal comparables is approximately $31,000. The mahogany sideboard alone, per the appraisal, is between $8,000 and $12,000. The oil paintings, if authenticated, which I have reason to believe they would be, are between $4,000 and $7,000 each. Dane said, "We weren't taking them, we were just—" Dane. I said his name once, quietly. He stopped. I'm not asking you to explain right now. I'm documenting what occurred. There is a difference." Garrett cleared his throat, his own version of the gesture, and said, Dane Cecily removing personal property from an estate prior to probate finalization this is a significant legal concern. The items described as belonging to the estate cannot be treated as personal property without formal distribution through this process. He paused. Renata has brought this to my attention, and I'm obligated to note it in the estate record. Cecily had put her copy of the documents on the table. She wasn't looking at them anymore. She was looking at me. "You photographed the house." It was not a question. There was something in her expression I can only describe as a kind of delayed recognition, the look of someone finally seeing the full dimensions of a room they thought they knew. 9 months ago, I said. Yes. Because you knew we would do this. I considered how to answer that. Because I'd learned, in my professional life, that documenting things before a dispute is more useful than documenting them during one. That's not an answer, Renata. It is, actually. There was a moment of silence in which I could hear the HVAC system in the building cycling and the muffled sound of a truck passing on the main street outside, and nothing else. Dane spoke. He had been quiet for longer than I expected, which told me he had been calculating. "So what do you want?" His voice was flat and businesslike, the register of a man who has moved past being caught and wants to negotiate terms. "What I want," I said, "is for the estate to be settled according to my father's wishes as documented in this will. That includes the property and its contents as they existed at the time of his death." I opened my notebook to a new page. The items listed in this document need to be returned to 414 Sycamore Lane within 10 business days, or their fair market value, as established by the appraisal, needs to be deducted from the distributions Cecily and Dane receive from the retirement accounts. Cecily said, "You want to deduct it from, those are your two options," I said. "Return the items or account for their value through the distribution. Garrett can formalize whichever approach you choose." I looked at Garrett. He nodded. Cecily sat back. She had her arms crossed over the will in front of her. Dad would have wanted us to work this out as a family. I looked at her for a moment. Dad documented his wishes with a lawyer and had them witnessed and signed. That is how he chose to work things out. I'm honoring his method. I learned it from him. That one landed. I saw it land. Cecily looked away. Dane said, "What about the earrings?" "The pearl ones you said were yours. They're in the personal property schedule. When you return the items, those will need to be part of it." Cecily made a sound, not quite a word, more of a sharp exhale. She picked up the personal property schedule from Garrett's stack and scanned it. I watched her find the entry. I watched her face as she read. 1 set pearl drop earrings. Gift from Gerald Voss to wife Deanne Voss, circa 1982, to Renata. Her jaw did not drop. But something in her posture shifted. The specific deflation of someone who had been certain of a thing and was now less certain. "Where are they?" I asked. A pause. "At home. Please return them with the other items. Or itemize them in the deduction." I said it the same way I say everything, no louder, no softer, no faster, no slower than the sentences around it. Garrett said, "I want to be clear to everyone in this room. What's been described here could, depending on the value of the items removed and the circumstances of removal, rise to the level of civil action. It is absolutely in everyone's interest to resolve this through the estate process, which is what Renata is proposing. I'd strongly recommend both of you consult with your own counsel before the 10-day deadline. Dane said, "We're not consulting lawyers, we're family." I said, "You can be both." He looked at me for a long moment. There was something in his face that I had not seen there in years, maybe ever, in adult form. It was not anger. Anger I was prepared for, would have weathered easily. It was something more like assessment. Like he was looking at me and finally doing the math on who he was actually dealing with. Good. That was the correct math to do, Cecily said quietly. Did you always plan to do this? Even before Dad died, did you know you were going to use those photographs? I documented the house because it was the responsible thing to do, I said. I hoped I wouldn't need to use the documentation. When I found the items missing, I used what I had. That's so. She paused. Started again. That is so you, Renata. You've been building a case since before there was even a case to build. I looked at her. Cecily. You removed $31,000 of estate property before the will was even read. Someone in this family had to be paying attention. My voice did not break. I did not let it. But I want you to know it wanted to. Because here is the thing that took the most composure to sit inside. I did not want to be right about this. I want you to understand that clearly. The 9-month-old photographs, the insurance rider, the appraisal, none of that was done from a place of righteous anticipation. It was done because I have lived my entire life in a family structure that required me to protect myself from the inside, and I have learned to do it without drama because the drama was never the point. The point was the house. The point was my father's wishes. The point was that the pearl earrings my father had specifically said were mine should be in a room where they belong. That was the point. Shh. Garrett was making notes on his legal pad. His assistant, I saw, had slipped back into the room at some point and was also taking notes. Good. Witnesses. Dane spoke again. When he did, his voice was different. Quieter. The businesslike tone had gone somewhere. Did Dad know what we were like, with each other? He wasn't asking me. He was asking the room, or the ceiling, or the version of my father that wasn't there to answer. Did he know how bad it had gotten? I thought about that for a moment. I thought about my father's hand on my shoulder. I thought about the car outside the oncology center in Columbus. He knew enough, I said. I think that's why he did what he did. Another silence. This one was different from the others. The first silences in that room had been tense, charged with the energy of people calculating. This silence was more like the aftermath of something, the settling of debris after an impact. Cecily said, eventually, "I'm sorry, Renata." Her voice was careful and specific in the way of a woman who means what she's saying, but also knows it is unlikely to fully land. About the items. We shouldn't have. I thought it would be different. I thought he would have divided things differently, and we were just. She stopped. Getting ahead of it, I said. Yes, I know. I did know. That was the exact and complete shape of it. They had assumed a distribution and acted preemptively on the assumption, which is the kind of thing people do when they have never had to be careful about money or consequences, because someone, their mother, their father, their more competent sibling, was always available to absorb the result. I said, I'm not asking for an apology, Cess. I'm asking for the items or their value. That's the transaction here. Whatever we do with the rest of it as a family is a different conversation for a different day. She nodded. Once. The kind of nod that means I understand what you're doing and I'm choosing not to fight it. Garrett wrapped up the remaining details of the will reading. There were insurance policies to account for, a small savings account, some minor bequests to a local church and a charity my father had supported for years. We worked through them methodically. The room had changed temperature. Not warm. We were not warm with each other by the end of that reading. Not in the way you see in movies where the revelation leads to a group embrace and a scene of earned togetherness. We were something more realistic. Three middle-aged siblings in a lawyer's office, in a town we'd all left, sitting with the residue of choices made over decades, trying to conduct a legal process with minimal additional damage. When it was over, Garrett asked Cecily and Dane if they had any final questions. Dane said no. Cecily said, "I want to know, the photographs. He didn't know you were taking them?" "No." "Did you feel bad about that?" I considered it honestly. I felt like I was doing the right thing. That's not the same as not feeling bad. No, I agreed. It's not. She picked up her folder of documents. She stood. She looked at me across the table with something that was. It was complicated. It was the face of a woman who was standing in the ruins of a version of events she had been planning for and seeing, perhaps for the first time, that the version had been wrong. Not wrong in the sense of, she didn't know what she was doing. Wrong in the deeper sense of, she had miscalculated who I was. She had spent 37 years treating me as the background character of our family story, and had arrived in this room expecting to find that assumption confirmed, and instead she was leaving with $31,000 of debt to an estate and a copy of a will that said the house she had been directing movers around 3 days ago, belonged to her older sister. I held her gaze. I let the silence do its work. "I'll have the things returned," she said. "All of them?" "Thank you," I said. She left. Dane nodded at me. A different nod from the one at the start of the meeting, longer and less smooth, and followed. I sat in the empty room for a moment. Garrett came back in from seeing them to the door and stood across the table from me. "That was well handled," he said. "My father taught me to document things," I said. He smiled. He did. I put my notebook in my bag. I picked up my envelope. I straightened the copies of the documents and put them in order and tucked them inside. I put on my coat. I thanked Garrett and his assistant by name. I walked down the stairs and out onto Millhaven's main street, into the April afternoon. And I stood outside for a moment in the plain gray Ohio light. And then I walked to my car. And I drove to the house on Sycamore Lane. I let myself in. I walked through the rooms. The spaces where the missing items had been were still empty. They would stay empty for 9 more days until the return was arranged. I walked into the dining room and I stood where the sideboard had stood, and I put my hand on the wall. Then I walked through every other room and I looked at what remained. The furniture, the bookshelves, my father's reading chair with the worn patch on the right armrest. The light through the windows was the specific pale gold of a Midwestern spring afternoon. The house smelled of old wood and the particular nothing of a space that has been holding its breath. "I've got it, Dad," I said to the empty room. I have never told anyone I said that until now. Then I locked the door and drove back to Columbus. In the 10 days that followed, I did not call Cecily or Dane. I worked. I took a client call on the Friday after the reading, a Saturday video call with Sylvia to document the outcome formally, and a long Sunday phone call with Adrian, who let me talk without interrupting for 40 minutes and then said, "You did everything right, and that's going to feel terrible for a little while," which was the most accurate thing anyone said to me during that period. On the 9th day, a moving company arrived at 414 Sycamore Lane with all 14 items. I was there to receive them. I walked through each piece against my list. The mahogany sideboard. The 2 oil paintings. The clock. 11 boxes, which I opened and checked against my photographic inventory. The china set. All 84 pieces, which I counted because I am my father's daughter. I did not laugh in the moment. I counted in silence while the movers stood waiting and probably found me extremely unusual. At the bottom of the last box, wrapped in tissue paper and placed carefully inside a teacup, the pearl earrings. I picked them up. I held them in my palm for a moment. They were exactly as I remembered them. Small, perfectly round, with the simple gold clasp my mother had always complained was fiddly but never had fixed. My father had bought them for her 39th anniversary. He had told me that in the car in Columbus. He had said, She wore them to everything important. I'd like you to have them for the same reason. I put them in my pocket. I tipped the movers. I thanked them. I walked through the house one final time and stood in each room for a moment and tried to take its full measure. What it had been, what it was now, what it was going to become. I had not yet decided what to do with it. Sell it, rent it, use it seasonally. These were all options I was evaluating without urgency, because the house was mine and I was in no hurry to resolve everything about that fact into a single decision. What I did decide, that afternoon, was the terms under which my family would have access to my life going forward. I wrote these terms in my notebook, not as a letter, but as architecture. The way I make all my important decisions, by putting them in writing first and seeing whether they hold their shape on paper. Cecily and Dane would not be given unilateral access to any property I owned. Visits to the Millhaven house when I was not present would not occur without my explicit, written permission. If there were future estate matters, anything related to my father's affairs during probate closeout, they would go through Garrett and Sylvia, not through informal family channels. Through the people whose job it is to make things official. I would not cut them off. I have thought carefully about this and want to explain why, because cutting them off would require a performance of injury I am not interested in sustaining. What I did instead was simpler and, I believe, more durable. I simply declined to pretend the last 41 years were other than what they had been. I stopped managing my own competence downward in family settings so that they would feel more comfortable. I stopped apologizing for the fact that I had made different choices, and those choices had yielded different results. I stopped being the family member who handles things quietly and invisibly in service of a closeness that had never, in practice, been mutual. I established, in other words, a relationship with my siblings, based on what was actually there, rather than on what I had been auditioning for since childhood. Now here is the part I didn't expect. 3 weeks after the will reading, Dane called me. Not a text. A call. I looked at the screen for 2 rings and then I answered. He said, I want to talk. Not about the house. Not about the house. Not about the stuff. Just talk. His voice was awkward and careful in the way of a man who doesn't do this often and knows it. I've been thinking about what you said in there, about Dad knowing what we were like. A pause. I think he knew more than we gave him credit for. I said, I think so too. I don't think I don't think I treated you fairly, Renata. Growing up. And since. He paused. I'm not asking you to. I don't need anything from you. I just wanted to say it. I sat with that for a moment. I appreciate you saying it, Dane. Okay. Another pause. Are you doing all right? I'm doing very well, I said. And I meant it. I meant it in the full, specific, documented sense of having looked at what I had built and found it solid. We talked for 22 more minutes. It was not a resolution. It was not a reconciliation in the movie montage sense. It was 2 adults who share a history and a surname having a conversation that was more honest than any conversation we'd had in 20 years. I will take that. I will put it in the column labeled Things That Are Actually There, and I will work with it carefully. My father's estate formally closed 6 months after the will reading. The probate process was unremarkable once the property matters were settled. Sylvia handled the closeout with characteristic efficiency and billed me what was fair, and told me I had been an unusually straightforward client, which I took as a professional compliment of the highest order. What happened to Cecily and Dane? They received their distributions from their retirement accounts, reduced by the agreed-upon valuations of the items they had returned, a total deduction of $28,000 split between them, which was arrived at through Garrett's formal accounting once the appraisal figures were applied. Cecily did not contest it. Dane, to his credit, did not contest it. I think the call he made to me was connected to that decision. I don't know for certain, and I haven't asked. Cecily and I have had 4 phone calls since the reading. They are shorter and more careful than the ones we had before. Less performed, more actual. She is working through something, I think. The specific and necessary work of re-examining a story you've been telling yourself about your own family, and finding that the version you have is incomplete. I know that work. It takes time. The house in Millhaven is currently being rented, long-term, to a young couple who are, from Patrice's reports, quiet and considerate and have already improved the garden along the back fence. I spent a week there in August, sorting and organizing, deciding which items would stay in the house and which would come to Columbus with me. I moved the oil paintings, my grandmother's paintings, the ones that would have left and never come back if I had not been paying attention, to my living room in Columbus, where they hang above the fireplace. Their gold leaf frames catch the afternoon light at an angle that fills the room with something I can only call warmth. The pearl earrings are in a small ceramic dish on my dresser. Next to them is the notebook, the one that has the entry from March 14th, 2 years ago, where I wrote down my father's words in the car outside the Columbus Oncology Center. I haven't moved either of them since I came home. Some mornings I look at them and I think about what my father said, the apology that could only take this particular form. I have made peace with the form. It is not the form I would have chosen if the choosing had been mine. I would have chosen the Sunday afternoon at the kitchen table, the ride to the bus station, the $60 in an envelope on the actual birthday. I would have chosen a mother who stayed to watch me cut the fruit. But I did not get to choose the form of the debt. I only got to choose what I did with what I was given and what I was not given. And I chose, as I always have, to build. The serviceberry tree in the back garden of my Columbus house is in its 5th year now. It bloomed in April. White flowers, delicate and brief, the way serviceberry flowers always are. I was home for it this year, which I haven't always been. I sat on the back porch with coffee on a Tuesday morning and I watched it bloom. Just that. Just the tree, and the coffee, and the morning. That's what the resolution looks like in practice. Not a trophy. Not a perfect reckoning that ties every thread. A Tuesday morning. A tree you planted because someone told you to plant it somewhere you intended to stay. I'm staying. If you have watched this far, I want to speak directly to you. Not the general you, the specific you. The one who was told at some point in your life that you were too much or not enough or hard to love or simply too far from the warm center of the room to deserve the things that were given easily to others. The one who figured things out alone and was never told that the figuring was extraordinary. The one who built carefully, documented quietly, and waited, not for rescue, but for the simple dignity of being seen accurately. I want you to know something. The quiet ones are not quiet because they have nothing to say. We are quiet because we learned very early to distinguish between speaking and being heard, and we refuse to spend our breath on the former in rooms that cannot offer the latter. That is not weakness. That is a form of precision so fine that most people will never recognize it as strength. You do not need to be loud to be powerful. You do not need to perform your pain for it to be real. You do not need the people who overlooked you to one day look back and see clearly. Though sometimes they do, and sometimes that is its own specific gift, worth receiving. What you need is what you have always had, the capacity to go forward, to document, to build, to plant something somewhere you intend to stay, and then, on a Tuesday morning in April, actually be there to watch it bloom. The inheritance was a house. I want to be clear that the inheritance was not the point. The point was this, that I had already built something no one could put in a moving truck. And so have you. If this story found you at the right time, if something in it felt like a room you've been in, like a silence you've kept, like a notebook you actually have, then subscribe. And drop your city below. Tell me where you watched from. Tell me where you're building from. I read every single comment. Every one. My name is Renata Voss. I am 41 years old. I own a house with serviceberry tree in the back garden, oil paintings above the fireplace, and a small ceramic dish on my dresser that holds a pair of pearl earrings that were always mine. I am exactly where I planned to be. Take care of yourselves.